Good afternoon. A warm welcome to all the participants who are joining us for the 18th edition of CII's Distinguished Lecture Series on Energy Efficiency. As many of you have been joining our sessions regularly, the idea of the Distinguished Lecture Series is to bring in thought leaders, people who have been very active on the energy efficiency space in the country, to talk to us about their perspectives, their thoughts, and their ideas in terms of where we are, how we are heading, and what needs to be done more in terms of accelerating the energy efficiency movement in the country. Over the last 17 months, we had the pleasure of hearing to some of the excellent speakers, their variety of thoughts and inputs, which gives us a trigger and action in terms of where each one of us can contribute as far as the energy efficiency journey in the country is concerned. And as all of you know, these lecture series are happening on the first Monday of every month between 4 p.m. and 5 p.m. And we are very glad to have for the 18th lecture series of the Distinguished Lecture Series on Energy Efficiency for the month of October, Mr. Upendra Bhatt, who is the co-founder and Managing Director of C-Kinetics, joining us to share his views, his thoughts, and his perspectives on energy efficiency in the country. Many of you would already know Mr. Bhatt through your interactions with him, but for the sake of introduction, Mr. Bhatt is the co-founder and Managing Director of C-Kinetics. He's been a go-to-market and a techno-commercial specialist with expertise in technology evaluation and linkages. Closely associated with developing infrastructure projects in South Asia, renewable energy projects, and shaping innovative market-driven models for mainstreaming technology and service interventions in developing markets. Mr. Bhatt has also had extensive involvement with Sustainable Business Leadership Forum, active member in the Alliance for Energy Efficient Economy, several task forces, a frequent speaker in several of the events. Many of us would have heard him speak at several international events. An alumni of Thunderbird, the American Graduate School for International Management, NMIMS Mumbai, and Delhi College of Engineering. Mr. Bhatt, we are sure the participants will benefit immensely from your expertise, your thought leadership on energy efficiency. The floor is yours, sir. You could start your lecture, Mr. Bhatt.
Thank you, Kiran. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today and try and share my thoughts. But firstly, thank you CII GBC for inviting me to share this. But as Kiran, you were presenting the past speakers, I was wondering whether there's anything left for me to add based on the really a very, very eclectic set of speakers that you guys have invited in the past. And also the fact that all of us are got bombarded with plethora of webinars through this past year because of COVID, and more so lately because of the COP26, where a lot of conversation is predicated on resource efficiency, and clearly the first pillar there is energy efficiency. Having said that, let me try and share a little bit based on our work on ground and also areas that I see becoming critical, because in a way, energy efficiency is an implicit dimension in most kind of initiatives that are underway. And so there's no point trying to become a renewable country if our solar PV technologies remain where they were 20 years back, because all gains lost on one hand will be squandered in the other. So that's the kind of conversation I would like to focus on, and also tie it into where I am seeing the financing conversation going on the ground level. I don't want to talk of big dollars. The numbers can be anywhere, depending on how one wants to, characterize the market. But there are clearly some learnings from the journey that the country has had over the last 2 decades, and which can form good, I would say, beachheads for developing the market in a very substantive fashion. I think even through COVID, what I have seen is there have been few energy services companies who have done extremely well. And as the industrial market started coming back, some of the hospitals, of course, never shut down. But so we are seeing some of those concepts now playing out. A few years back, people would kind of engage in a rather, I would say, patchwork manner when you were trying to set up these contracts. So with that, let me just, for those of us who do not know us, just want to give a quick overview on our work. Could we just move to the next slide, please? So we are, as Kiran mentioned, a mission-driven sustainability advisory firm. But what kind of differentiates or distinguishes our work is at two levels. One, whatever our work is, it involves a capital dimension to it, and therefore we try and make the business case real for all our clients. The second is it is typically underpinned by technology innovation, because what we believe is this transition which is underway is a mega trend, though it will take several decades for all the pieces to come together, just as we saw when the first industrial revolution hit us. Sustainability conversation will emerge, and we are already seeing that in the last decade or so, become center stage, but the form and shape will keep on evolving. And so there's a lot of work underway. So our work cuts across insights, which is purely around building a point of view and framing a blueprint, if I can use, for what can make sense going forward in the short term, medium term, long term. A lot of our work is in kind of helping implement net zero approaches for large corporates as also their supply chain partners. On the innovation side, this is something very close to me personally. I try and see what kind of ventures are emerging on the landscape, with both on business approaches side, because innovation can be both at a technology and at a business approach level, given what's happening. And then how do you link these to the capital dimension? Because at the end of the day, the proof of the pudding is in the uptake of that technology and uptake of that model. There's no point having a lot of pilots, but not having the ability to see them replicated at scale through market-enabled mechanisms. So that's really the core of what C-Kinetics does. Could we move on to the next slide? We work across 7 odd countries, though we had done projects perhaps in a much larger footprint across a variety of industries. And like I said, the continuum goes all the way from intervention identification, project development support, and capital facilitation. Just a snapshot of our work through the last financial year. You can see this over 8 gigawatt hours of electricity saved. These are all in industrial units. A lot of work on the water side as well, because there's a very strong energy water nexus, particularly, most see it in agriculture, but we see it a lot of it in the industrial side. And we have built and developed some proprietary frameworks to help enable this efficient transition. On the finance side, we were, quite pleased to partner and invest through our accelerator in one of the more leading ESCOs, Smart Joules. And the other arm that we have, which does more mainstream project financing, invested in about 4, it's not investing, but financed 4 companies through this period. This is just over the last 12, 14 months, despite the COVID slowdowns. So that's, we can come back to this based on how we see this play out in different industries. But essentially, all the work is to foster and implement market-driven solutions. And that's really what makes it exciting for us. That's what makes it challenging for us, to be candid, because when you go deeper into resource efficiency, particularly in technologies or equipment which is not core to the production, they do not necessarily get as much priority. And particularly if it is a multi-year payback. So that's the kind of rejig we try and do, is to how to make it center stage for our various partners. Could we move on to the next one, please? But before we go there, I wanted to kind of open it up with, we are all trying to see how the future will unfold. So in the some previous work that we did, we tried to see how did we see today in the past. So what you saw in 70s, we thought geothermal and nuclear will play a much more leading role versus what we are seeing where it is. So societal pressures, geopolitical dimensions, etc., all have played a role, but in a sense, what we predicted as a primary transition didn't happen. Second, as we moved a decade forward, we started seeing that more and more linear growth started becoming center stage and started imputing its own pressures. And I think for the first time, post mid 70s oil shock and early 80s, industries at large globally started feeling what the impact of a linear growth really entails and what it means and what it would do in terms of the energy requirements. In early 2000s, we started talking about solar and wind, but we never saw the kind of scale up, including in our own country, that has happened. And frankly, with even someone like us who's very, very close to this, in the first half of the last decade, we weren't necessarily sure whether this is a resilient movement. And yes, there are still market deficiencies, there are still some challenges, etc. But clearly, the shift has happened, and it has happened in a form and shape where there's a very large ecosystem which has fructified, and I think the maturity of that ecosystem will enable this growth to continue. What we also can see through this last 30, 40 years of progression on the energy systems is that energy supply technologies have never scaled more than 1 order of magnitude per decade. Why is this important? Because we are suddenly waking up to the need to limit temperature rise to below 1.5, and we are saying we are almost out of time and everything needs to be done in this decade. So if this is really the situation, where is the innovation going to come from? And it's very, very clear that most disruptive innovation that is needed to help realize this 1.5 degree scenario cannot wait for new technologies to be invented. Yes, some of them are in TRL 5, 6, and we could tap into those over the next 15 years. But essentially, we have to rely on what is within the current Chinese menu with us. And therefore, the first thing we need to do is what can we do to mitigate or address demand or optimize demand, and which is where I think efficiency and any efficient design becomes extremely, extremely critical. Shall we move on? So as we see, and most of the conversation these days, I'm sure in our respective organizations, as also in the industries that we are operating in, is all predicated on new forms of energy production, storage, what can we do on self-generation, etc. But outside of the conventional efficiency as well, in each of these areas, efficiency is emerging as a key lever. Even as there are 2 or 3 mega trends in the backdrop, we already see miniaturization becoming a very, very important element, particularly when you start looking at distributed production and generation systems. We are also seeing digitization, led with IoT and in different forms and shapes, play an extremely critical role in designing intelligent systems, intelligent homes, intelligent societies. And this will continue to be a mega trend for the next 2-3 decades. The last one, which we see increasingly, is convergence that we are seeing across different kinds of distributed generation and storage coupling that we are seeing. What one can see really clearly is that these things by themselves are going to be disruptive when it comes to new business models like the vehicle to grid, etc. These could take the form of demand response, it could take other forms, but in a sense, they are going to disrupt the way we think about energy systems, the way we look at energy systems. Grid is likely to become a bi-directional one in a very, very substantive fashion, most likely driven at the tail end to peer-to-peer mechanisms. We also believe, based on our work at C Kinetics, that distributed industrial waste heat energy harvesting will become a core pillar of this transition. We are seeing some early disruptive technologies becoming center stage there. And we believe this will go beyond large scale industries into a lot of other kind of interventions. We also believe waste and water will become key to this transition. whether it is gasifiers, whether it is microbial fuel cells. So, one can come up with a whole slew of interventions, but these are some that we believe will certainly get center stage within this decade. Now, if we look at all of this, and then put it in context of how the Bureau of Energy Efficiency and other policy bodies are looking at the role of energy efficiency, we see that almost 15% of energy's consumption by the end of this decade could get met through efficiency while enabling all of this disruption. So clearly that opens up a very, very strong window of opportunity. Yes, I'm sorry, am I audible, guys?
Yes, sir, you are audible. We can hear you.
Sorry, I thought there was some disruption. Okay, right. The other part of it is we are moving into an extremely aspirational society. So we will continue to see uptake, air conditioning, which was 6 to 7% of our penetration, will go up to 30-35%. We will see new buildings, construction of 60-70% of that stock to be built over the next 15 years. And so aspirationally, we will continue to grow, and therefore the E as a tenet of that growth becomes extremely critical as well. So these numbers or these statistics are likely to remain so unless we use an innovation dimension and really make E central to all these new products and services. And one can see it in very, very clear ways, both across industrial and residential. And one can, build it across other sectors as well, where we are already seeing uptake of low-cost measurement and monitoring systems, which in my view is almost the first thing, because unless you have a baseline, what you can't measure, you can't track. What you can't track, you will not improve. The other thing we are seeing increasingly is people looking at innovations and disruptions and technical modifications across a whole slew of utilities in the industrial space, be it on feed water, fuel, ash, electrical, lighting, you can name, and there are several providers. On the residential sector, we are increasingly seeing, and this trend is slowly picking up in the Indian context. You can see some of the new builders focusing on this. It's still not center stage, but I do see this becoming center stage within this decade, where you see an increasing role of intelligent sensors, to upscale home energy efficiency, to have comprehensive automated control. The second thing we see is a lot of innovation in refrigeration and cooling, because this is one core component which will increase to our demand and will make a difference. In the last few years, what has happened is while this energy has gone up, requirement has gone up, it has kind of got offset with the efficiency gains we have made on the appliance front. So your demand has gone up, but your energy is more or less still plateaued. But it's unlikely to remain that, just given the numbers of people that will take this up. So efficiency needs to kind of keep track of this and add to that to make this work. We are already seeing a lot of work being done on insulation side, reflective roofing. So, St. Gobain and some others are doing a phenomenal job with some of these things. And so I do see a lot of uptake of this. Could we move on to the next one, please? So clearly, megawatts matter. We call it the first fuel. But if you really look at it, I would see this as coming from 3 pillars. First one is SDG 7.3 itself talks about doubling the energy efficiency rate by the end of this decade. This is nothing but if you apply it over a period of time, it is what is also called EP100. So we are already seeing conversation moving from EE to EP in a big way. And once it is linked to energy productivity, clearly it is more top line oriented, and therefore will see the prioritization from the boardrooms. The second one is that even in the last 2 decades, as this became our journey with Bureau of Energy Efficiency leading the way, and institutions like EESL kind of doing a very, very good job on demand aggregation, we have delivered around 300 million tons of CO2 emission reductions. And this is last 18, 19 years. Even when we started with a very voluntary approach, slowly took it down to a little bit of a mandatory for X amount of enterprises, and therefore now moving towards a market enablement and intensification of market enablement. We already see that kind of effort in effect. Yes, it has led also created its own, I would say, loopholes that we can talk about a little later, but clearly it has an opportunity to upscale. And this opportunity, as based on several market researches, is at least $600 billion over the next decade alone. So it's not a small market if one would want to look at it. This cuts across an entire spectrum of equipment and services, but it's clearly a large enough number to focus on. If we see this in context of our NDCs, what India is already committed to and seeing, clearly efficiency, whether it is in the power sector, industrial sector, agriculture sector, transport sector, is almost a key enabler for those numbers. Those numbers will not be met purely by shifting to RE. We will just not be, yes, it is an RE is clearly, the leader with unpacking the opportunity, but E is across its various dimensions will play a key role. And if one looks at it, we are already seeing some market models emerge. It's not an easy thing given that the discoms are still, state-led and state-owned, and therefore one needs to think of innovative structures. How do you catalyze industry action? We see some good action coming from large industries. I think we need to kind of intensify work in the supply chain. And I think it will be imperative on the large corporates as they start thinking about going beyond carbon neutrality of scope 1, 2 to including scope 3 action, that this will become almost an important prerequisite for them and the reporting back to their own investors. Can we move on to the next one, please? So it's clearly a low-hanging fruit. And it's been talked about. It is not something new that I can highlight to the audience here. A lot of this is well known. I've just illustrated a few here where on the paper, the business case looks pretty decent. And yet this is not fully tapped. So the question really is, what is holding us back? Clearly, I mentioned something earlier that E is implicit. And so sometimes it doesn't get counted because there's an equipment change happening and it is seen in that context and not necessarily. So it is kind of seen that it's natural progression. The other aspect to it, as I also highlighted, is that wherever it is not central to your production, it is more often than not across big and small firms deprioritized. So they're happy if somebody else will come and make that investment and and kind of demonstrate the savings. They are willing to have shared savings and other aspects, but rarely would they want to prioritize their growth capital for that. And it's actually inability of market catalysts like ourselves to not have cracked that conundrum sooner on how this can be done. How do you take, and it's not just, ESCO is one intervention structure. There can be other ways in which this could be done, but we haven't necessarily done a good job of it so far, or as good a job as is possible given the opportunity. The second is that there is clearly skill building which has been ongoing, but much more is needed. And I think that becomes important because many of the mid-sized organizations are not comfortable looking at complexity. They want things to be dumbed down. So unless there are experts in their group or available to them at with the requisite level of finesse, they're unlikely to see this. Third is the pricing policy, and in my view, I believe this is a strong deterrent in several sectors. Take the case of agriculture, even in many states in residential, etc. It actually defies logic why somebody would invest in an energy efficient device if the payback is going to be 6 years, but the the discount tariff is so much cheaper. So I think it really requires a rethink and a rejig if we want to create that behavioral change. There are other aspects which go into the institutional governance frameworks, etc. Given that E is cross-cutting, how do you bring alignment? We see situations where certain things fall under ECBC, certain things fall elsewhere. But I think all of that can still be sorted out if one can bring together a market momentum, not necessarily always catalyzed by policy. So I think that is where I think the enabling conditions are slowly there, and it's for us to build it out. And I'll share a few ways in which it can be done going forward. Yeah. Can we move to the next, please? So this is, what I was talking about. If we really look at a snapshot of how business is being done today, you see a lot of projects under deemed savings. And, most of it is that the buyer has to pay for because deemed saving is well accepted, well understood, etc., etc. But you see that this is kind of not necessarily fully getting leveraging the opportunity on ground, even where the customers are comfortable with the intervention, because for a variety of reasons, they're not seen as bankable, they're not seen as there's not enough benchmark data, etc., etc. The second aspect is on the guaranteed savings. So far, the HVAC market seems to be doing well. We are seeing increasingly business models where people are working with this and saying, okay, I'm comfortable working with this structure, and whatever is the, or maybe they start with shared savings and move towards guaranteed savings. But in principle, HVAC seems to be doing a very good progression in this energy services space as we look at it. But we see a lot of things where there's opportunity, where we still need to develop a comprehensive M&V structure. We need to at a cost in a cost-effective manner, and that is what keeps things kind of away from uptake. Because if you look at it, a lot of low market adoption is really areas where there is seasonality of loads and processes. There's uncertainty around baseline and variations, and therefore, even in waste heat recovery, we have seen several cases where projects get implemented, but then there's a change. So you actually end up getting uncertain around whether the business case itself was weak or whether it is the process change. So it again introduces complexity, which many mid-sized companies are uncomfortable or unwilling to take. So it is in that backdrop that there is a comprehensive finances dilemma, and what, there are obviously, interventions that have been undertaken. There is a partial risk guarantee facility. There's a small venture fund which is supposed to support and enable. You see a lot of other participants now looking at this space. But if one wants to look at it from a comprehensive project financing, while the large suppliers have balance sheets and banking relations to offer those solutions and services, assuming the contractual structures work out, the rest of the folks are still extremely in an uncertain way. And therefore, even when a decade back, when the ESCO model was seen as an enabler, and you have close to 150 plus empaneled entities, you do not see ESCOs playing the role of ESCOs. They are more of playing the role of EPC contractors, etc., because we have not been able to enable the contracting structures to support that transition. Call it a trust deficit, call it lack of data, call it lack of track record. All of that combined really creates a high perception of risk, and therefore, even where there is a good technology solution, in absence of a good business approach, it becomes a limiting opportunity. And that is why, we have seen solar or other where things are very visible and comparatively simpler take a march on EE, because, for very small sizes, the transaction costs are perceived to be much higher, and standardization approaches haven't necessarily panned out with the form and shape that one expected. Can we move on, please? So what can we do really? And this is really my last slide on this. We can talk more. One is clearly demand creation. A lot has been done at pilot levels, etc. And but I do believe the opportunity is ripe for both on the industrial and MSME side for a large scale demand creation approach. There are pressure points. There is, I think, global imperatives on several industries. And so this is a good opportunity for us to take this forward. Second is there is growing awareness, but uncertain outlook on the selection of the vendors and the technologies. So there are a lot of, in the last 2-3 years, I've seen a lot of self-help tools get crafted for different industries, and those are being presented, but not there's not even a comprehensive awareness around it. And the role of SDAs becomes critical in enabling that to go beyond the early adopters to make that center stage. This other thing is that how do you create solutions that are simple for people to understand and allow for transactions to get closed in a finite time? Otherwise, even with very sophisticated experienced companies, we see several months of back and forth before people come to a comprehensive solution. So that's one aspect. We believe some of the learnings from the cluster aggregations that have been undertaken in the past can be taken up further, but I think it is important it is taken up by market players across use cases which are here and now. There's no point trying to push subsidy-based models where then you are unsure about availability and the business case is purely predicated on that. And therefore, once that is not there, it becomes a core difference, limiting factor. On the ecosystem efforts, I think even as I talked about the mega trends around digitization, etc., a lot of that will really enable M&V, the monitoring and the verification, because I think that's almost a key to enabling energy performance. You can have very sophisticated BMS, you can have very less sophisticated, but really this is a key enabler. It also will feed into the way one would characterize risk in projects. It will also characterize how credit is seen for these projects. We are currently working towards designing some contract insurances focused on EE markets. We need to see how that will play out. It's still early days. But I think the fact that we are able to have some of these conversations with insurers and reinsurers shows that the market has started demonstrating some visibility to them. And consequently, there is some interest and ability to look at structures which normally would have been seen as extremely risky. Yes, it will come at a cost. One will need to see how that cost gets absorbed within the project pricing or the equipment pricing, but we see a direction moving there. I think one of the aspects when we look at ESCO as an enabler is how do you do contract enforcement? This is a big area, and I think this is where CII and other industry bodies could play a role in how do you create structures where or create mechanics in our judicial system for a better contract enforcement. You could have standardized contracts to keep it simpler, but it is also about balancing between large industrial players and innovators who are presenting these solutions, because typically the large industrial buyers have significant leverage. So it cuts across both areas. I talked about the tariff structure changes. The last bit, as we are going through these changes and disruptive technologies are emerging on the horizon, it's quite likely we may get excited and pick up technologies. I think it is important we try and see what are the technologies which will allow us not to get locked in. Because if there are technologies on the horizon 15 years from now, let's take case of hydrogen or others, if we end up locking ourselves into infrastructure, which is going to last for 30, 35 years, getting into this and, would end up limiting our ability to undertake that innovation. And I think this is particularly critical when it comes to storage solutions, etc., since they are here and now, there's a lot of opportunity there. So how do you kind of look at that? Also true for several of the industrial equipment, which is underway. The other aspect to all of this is how do you create a positive correlation with businesses? I think there is clearly a need for adoption of new technologies, but how do you decide where do you mandate a new technology adoption versus retrofits? And I think increasingly an implicit carbon price will force this transition and this discussion. Our bet is over the next 3 years, there'll be significant changes on the policy landscape, which will require companies to start not just we have a new BRSR, the business, responsibility and sustainability reporting framework, which is trying to intensify the, not just the conventional uh, uh, actions of the companies, but it is going much beyond that to look at what is your climate action, what are you planning to do, how are you looking to mitigate that. So clearly the role of this correlation of energy and business will become more and more central as you take it. I think this will also force a certain process optimization, which is where I think EP100 or any such intervention will become central, because energy productivity requires process optimization and process innovation. In absence of that, just doing low-hanging fruit will not, that will take us to 5, 7, 8% intervention, but you will not be able to go to and deliver on that 50% improvement goal. But it is clearly a requirement of changing mindsets, which will allow that. So whether we look at it from an innovation point of view, whether we look at it from a perspective of, the disruption that we are facing in our businesses through new tools, or we look at it from a perspective of remaining relevant to our investors, clearly, this mindset change is going to be a key ingredient on identifying organizations which are seen as innovators. And overall, I believe the efficiency dimension will be the first pillar on which these changes will accrue. So let me stop there. I don't think there's anything beyond this, but let me stop there and see if I made it on time, as you suggested, Kiran, and see what.
It's perfect, Mr. Bhatt. Thank you very much. Thank you for